Daisy swayed back and forth in her chair, a thin stream of drool hanging from the corner of her mouth. She appeared not to notice it, and she appeared not to have heard Dr. Jenner's question, so he gently repeated it. "Why do you want to eat human flesh, Daisy?" Her eyes seemed to meet his for a moment, and he drew in his breath, for he swore he'd seen a spark there, though of what he couldn't be sure. Was it simply hunger, or the effects of the drug the nurses came to inject every 4 hours? Or could it have been something else? Perhaps nothing as profound as intelligence, no, but maybe a kind of rudimentary understanding at least. He didn't want to get too excited. It had only been a flash, a second, but he couldn't help his palms moistening. "Daisy, can you hear me? Do you understand?" He was leaning toward her now, closer than he should have, really. The reanimated were still dangerous, despite the medication, and it never paid to be careless around them. But Daisy seemed far more responsive than any of the other patients he'd interviewed in the clinic. He realized that wasn't saying much, but in this case he'd take what he could get. She was swaying endlessly, like a snake looking for a place to strike. All of them did that, and he assumed it was simply a manifestation of their condition, filtered through the pharmaceuticals they were forced to take by law. She still didn't speak. None of them did, or at least they never had when live humans were around, but her strange eyes were fixed on his again, and this time they didn't simply drift away but held there, seeming to focus sharply behind their milky lenses. Dr. Jenner felt his pulse beginning to race. "You do understand me, don't you?" he said, whispering as if the two of them were sharing some delicious secret. This could change everything. He sat there for another hour, firing questions at her and still getting no answers, but becoming more and more certain that he was getting through to her on some level, which was far more than he could say about any of the others. When he finally left the clinic, he called out a musical goodbye to Vera at the nurse's station. "Any luck today, Doc?" she asked him. "Yes, Vera, I think my luck is improving. You will call me immediately if any of them say a single word, won't you?" "You know I will. Have a good one." "Indeed. Good day, Vera." Dr. Jenner left the clinic, not noticing the way Vera smiled indulgently and shook her head at his receding back. When he'd returned to his office and scribbled a few notes about the session, he found that he was too elated to sit still and paced around his desk like a caged animal, twisting his hands in front of him. Today had really been the start of something big. He could feel it. At last he might have some solid evidence to back up his theory, and if he could get enough data together to publish by the spring. He chuckled to himself. Dr. Emerson's book wouldn't be out until midsummer at the very earliest. He wanted to beat the old bastard to the punch. Still restless, Jenner began pacing before his bookshelves, scanning the titles even though he could have recited them from memory. Zombie Nature, Understanding the Reanimated, Exploring the Undead Mind. Knowing he was torturing himself a little, he pulled a copy of Emerson's first book off the shelf. It was called The Cannibal Conundrum, and Jenner sneered down at its cover without being aware he was doing it. It had always irritated him that his rival, that crotchety, ancient representative of the old guard, had beaten him to publication on a subject that was so central to his own field of research. Namely, when and why had zombies, the undead but generally docile slaves familiar on Haitian plantations, morphed into the cannibalistic monsters of the modern day. Dr. Emerson had taken a strictly naturalistic route in his well-received book. He'd argued that the lust for human flesh was simply a genetic mutation of the rare but potent virus that triggered zombification after death. The book was persuasive, Jenner had to admit that, but he was convinced that there was more to the story. The zombies, as he'd pointed out in his short critique of the book, didn't have to eat human flesh to survive. The fact that so many of them were housed in clinics where they were fed nothing but vegetables and large doses of cannibal-inhibiting pharmaceuticals proved that much. The inmates of the numerous zombie clinics around the country, while no one's candidates for inclusion in the human family, were certainly as healthy as zombies were ever likely to be. So if it wasn't a need, was it a choice, an addiction, a tradition carried in the collective zombie consciousness? That was what Jenner was aiming to find out. He realized that his colleagues thought he was wasting his time. They all believed that Jenner's theory relied too much on zombie intelligence, which most everyone in the field agreed did not really exist to anywhere near a human standard. Emerson had even ridiculed Jenner's notions to his face at a conference a few months ago. "They're nothing but electric meat, Jack," he'd said, pouring a third cocktail into the black hole of his condescending smugness. "They're like animals, worse than animals. There's no thinking process going on at all. They don't mate, they don't feel compassion for others of their kind, they just kill and eat." Jenner had wanted to deck the bastard right there and then, but he was able to control himself, if just barely. Revenge would come later, he knew, when he published the definitive work on the change, as it was termed in scientific circles. His work would be so brilliant that he would be entirely vindicated, and no one would possibly be able to refute his ideas. Daisy would help him in his endeavors. She might even aid him in communicating with others of her undead kind, and who would be laughing then? Smiling, he slid Emerson's book back onto the shelf. He couldn't wait to get back to the clinic. The next day, Jenner didn't even bother with any of the other patients. He went directly to Daisy. She looked as though she hadn't moved an inch since yesterday, and it was likely she hadn't. The Reanimated didn't need sleep or exercise, and it wasn't as though they had any hobbies to entertain themselves. The nurses kept televisions blaring in all the inmates' rooms, but Jenner had never observed any of them paying the slightest bit of attention. "Hello, Daisy." He sat across from her at the table in the corner. The door to her room was open as it always was, and Jenner could hear nurses talking and laughing in the halls, and below that the shuffling footsteps of the heavily medicated undead. Daisy drooled and swayed, but she was undoubtedly looking at him. "How are you today?" She didn't reply, of course. Her eyes burned red, a symptom of the zombification. Jenner found himself wondering what she had been like when she'd still been alive. It was hard to tell now, what with her chalk-white pallor, flaking skin, and underlying decay stench, but he supposed it was possible that she might have been beautiful. Yes, he could imagine it if he looked hard enough. For another little while, he plied her with questions, the same ones he'd asked her yesterday, the same ones he'd been asking all of them fruitlessly in the 2 months since he'd started this research. He wanted to know how she felt, what she thought about, why she felt compelled to eat human flesh. She seemed to be listening, but after a while, Jenner began to get the distinct impression that she was taunting him with her silence. "I know you could talk if you wanted to," he told her conspiratorially, leaning in close again, so close that the rotting smell nearly gagged him, despite it being covered up with various powders and creams. "I promise I won't tell anyone." Daisy drooled and swayed. Jenner sat back and studied her. She almost seemed to want to talk to him. He knew he could break down her resolve given enough time. That was the problem, though. The damn clinic only allowed him to visit 2 hours a day, so any progress he might make usually had to be begun from scratch on the following afternoon. He needed to observe Daisy 24/7, watch her habits, and see if she let something slip when she didn't know he was looking. And he needed to study her natural behavior, which meant weaning her off the medication. He tapped his chin with one finger, noting that Daisy's eyes clearly followed the movement. Could he get her out somehow? He turned and glanced over his shoulder as though he'd thought aloud. In a way, he couldn't believe he was even considering such a scheme, and yet... Her eyes were blazing now, as if she could read his mind. Jenner stared back at her. Would it really be that difficult? Take her out for a short spin in the courtyard, and then wander ever so casually off the path? It wasn't as though anyone would care or mourn her disappearance. The Reanimated were practically untouchables, creatures one tried not to mention or even think about, especially if they were among one's family members. There would be no one to miss Daisy. Of course, the act of liberating a zombie from a clinic, or of deliberately denying them their inhibiting drugs, was a fairly serious offense. But Jenner was after bigger game, a complete understanding of the zombie mind and motivation, and for that he supposed a little law-breaking was more or less justified. The doctor chuckled to himself. Sure, he was only blue-skying. He'd never really have the nerve to pull it off. He'd get caught and disgraced, and his career might very well be irreparably damaged. Still, it would make his research so much easier and more complete, having a subject so near to hand. Daisy made a noise then, a sort of snuffling grunt, and Jenner nearly jumped out of his chair. It was the first sound he'd ever heard her make, and it caused his skin to prickle as much with unease as excitement. "Are you still here?" For a second, Jenner thought the zombie had actually spoken. His heart leaped into his throat. Then he realized it was only Vera, standing in the doorway behind him. Visiting hours were over 20 minutes ago, and it's time for Miss Daisy's shot. He heard the nurse's shoes squeaking as she crossed the floor. Then she emerged in his peripheral vision, a large hypodermic clasped in one hand. Jenner got to his feet. "Sorry, Vera, I was just leaving." "Good thing, too. When Miss Daisy doesn't get her injection, she gets a little..." Vera smiled and chomped her teeth together repeatedly. "Peckish." "Indeed." Jenner gave the zombie one last glance as he left her room. She was still staring at him, her red eyes flashing like twin signals of warning. When Jenner arrived at the clinic the next day, he pulled his car into the closest space, the one that butted right up to the sidewalk off the courtyard. The space happened to be empty, and he parked there without really thinking about why he had done it. He'd had a horrible morning. Emerson had stopped by his office, ostensibly to borrow a monograph on the zombie cortex, but Jenner got the idea that the old coot really wanted to screw around with him a bit, get in a few choice words about his research. Jenner tried to remain professional, tried to maintain his tight little smile in the face of Emerson's subtle digs, but the effort made his head pound. By the time the older scientist had finally left, Jenner's temples were throbbing so hard that he could barely see. Now, at the clinic, he sat in his car for a few minutes, realizing at last where he had parked and what his motive might have been for doing so. He could still hear Emerson's snide comments reverberating through his brain, providing a rhythm for his still blinding headache. Having any luck talking to the dead? The old man had chuckled, strolling around Jenner's office as though he owned the place. You become quite the laughingstock at the Hilldale clinic. The nurses think you're crazier than the patients. He'd said it lightly, as if he were joking, but there were barbs beneath the words. Jenner had turned to look out the office window so that Emerson wouldn't see the scarlet flush in his cheeks. I'm making quite good progress with one woman there. He tried to keep his voice calm and level. Oh, and has she spilled all the darkest secrets of zombiedom into your waiting ears? Jenner could hear the smirk in his rival's tone. She understands what I'm saying, Jenner shot back, biting down on the next phrase, which is more than I could ever say for you. He was irritated by his own petulance, but Emerson could always push his buttons. He didn't mention the fact that Daisy had never actually spoken a word. My dear Dr. Jenner, the old man said, and Jenner had a sudden vision of slapping the condescending look clean off his face. The Reanimated see us in the same way that we humans would see a particularly appetizing brisket. They cannot help what they are, but that is all that they are. He sighed, signifying that the conversation at hand now officially bored him and should be brought to an end as quickly as possible. Anyway, thanks for the monograph, I'll return it directly. And don't get too attached to the flesh eaters, will you, old boy? I'm telling you as a friend. Jenner had heard the door of his office close behind him and had to work to stifle a scream of rage. Then he shook his head back in the present, back in his car at the clinic, that he'd parked in such a transparently convenient spot. The sun streaming through the windshield seemed suddenly too bright and too warm. He opened the door and unfolded himself from the seat, grunting as he straightened his back and smoothed his gray suit jacket. Then, putting all other thoughts aside, he marched toward the clinic doors. Jenner waved to Vera, trying to look casual, nonchalant, even though his mouth was too dry to speak. After swallowing a few times, he tried again. Say, Vera, you don't mind if I take Daisy outside for a bit, do you? Change of scenery and all that. The nurse shouldn't find anything suspicious, he reasoned. After all, didn't all the nurses take the patients outside for walks sometimes? But Vera still seemed to give him a very fleeting look, there then gone before he could identify it. Certainly, doctor, she said, smiling tightly. Just stay in the courtyard and don't keep her too long. You can count on me. Jenner coughed into his fist, his tongue like sandpaper. He felt he should say something more, but he couldn't think of a blessed thing, so he waved weakly at Vera, then turned and headed for Daisy's room. 15 minutes later, he was pulling out of the parking lot with the zombie strapped into the seat beside him. He couldn't believe how easy it had been, how it seemed that luck was going his way. Or could it be that the clinic employees had seen him but deliberately looked the other way, secretly glad to have one less drooling subhuman to deal with? It didn't matter, he supposed. In the end, he had made it. He turned left and started up the road, wanting to stomp on the gas and put as many miles between himself and the clinic as possible. But he held back, not wanting to attract unnecessary attention. His palms were slick on the steering wheel. He glanced at Daisy in the passenger seat, wondering if she understood that she was free. It didn't seem likely. She was simply staring out the window and swaying, the way she usually done at the clinic. Jenner couldn't help but feel a little disappointed that she wasn't expressing at least a minimal amount of excitement at her new surroundings. He concentrated on the road ahead. He couldn't take her home, that much was certain. The authorities would be on him in hours, and the scandal would ruin his career in not much more time than that. Emerson in particular would get a big hearty laugh about the whole thing. So instead, Jenner drove a few miles on the highway, finally stopping at a vaguely dingy roadside motel, with no sign and only 1 or 2 cars in the lot. He left Daisy in the car as he went into the front desk and checked in under the name Wade Davis. Then, key in hand, he pulled the car in front of the room and hustled the zombie inside, under cover of the falling dusk. For the first hour or two, Daisy was just as docile as she'd been at the clinic, but then, little by little, the medication began to wear off. She seemed to become restless, getting up from her chair and wandering aimlessly around the room, stopping occasionally to stare at the poorly done landscape painting on the wall, or at the meaningless images flickering across the television screen. Jenner had been trying to talk to her since they'd arrived, but it was clear she wasn't paying attention. He was getting increasingly frustrated, shouting questions at her and then cursing himself, hoping the people in the other rooms wouldn't hear him and complain about the noise. He was beginning to think that her supposedly alert gaze at the hospital was simply a product of his imagination, or perhaps a symptom of the drugs. He slumped back on the bed, gripping at his temples as though he could preemptively dislodge the headache that was beginning to take up residence there. Jenner dozed off without realizing it, all the stress and setbacks of the past few days finally catching up to him. He was dreaming about a dog he'd had when he was a boy, a husky puppy that used to lick heartily at his hands and feet. When he opened his eyes, he was still so immersed in the memory, a delighted laugh playing about his lips, that for a moment his brain didn't register what it was seeing. When it finally did, he leaped back against the wall, drawing his bare feet under his body in a single motion. His toes had been in her mouth, and she'd been chewing on them. He stared at her, horrified. In return, she just gazed stupidly. But was there a flicker of rage in her eyes at being denied a meal? He couldn't be sure. "No!" he yelled, still keeping all his limbs clutched tight to his body, even though she had made no further move toward him. "No, not me!" He sounded as though he was castigating a toddler, and he felt ridiculous, but he had to make her understand. Part of his anger was derived from the fact that he thought she did understand, and was simply being disobedient. Daisy's head tilted to one side. The harsh neon glow from the bathroom light was not kind to her flaky countenance, giving it a ghoulish green tinge. The medication had fully worn off now. Though she still didn't move, Jenner thought he heard a growl, a rattling purr emanating from the back of her throat. She crouched at the end of the bed. She definitely looked angry now, and hungry. Shit. Jenner rarely swore, but the occasion seemed to merit the slip. What was he going to do with her? Trying to talk her out of eating him might not be the most effective strategy. He supposed he could go to the grocery store, buy some raw steaks or something, see if she would eat those instead, which even he realized was unlikely. But he didn't want to leave her alone in the motel room. What if someone came? What if she got out? He swore again, chastising himself for his woeful lack of planning. He thought he'd been so smart, thought he'd be the one to break through the zombie reticence and actually understand these creatures, even be able to communicate with them yes, even to talk them out of eating human flesh. Had he really thought he'd be able to do that? With a laugh, he realized that he had pictured something like that. Another curse escaped his lips, this one for his folly. He'd have to get her out of here, take her somewhere that she could feed without attracting attention. He still held out hope that he'd be able to break her of her cannibalistic habits, but for now he'd have to humor her. Maybe when she wasn't so hungry, she'd be more reasonable. So where could he take her? On some level, he couldn't believe that he was actually contemplating setting Daisy loose on some unsuspecting person out there, but what choice did he have? Let her chow down on him and hope that she didn't eat enough to cause him to bleed to death? He had started this whole fiasco by busting her out of the clinic, so now he'd have to see it through to the end. Jenner carefully climbed down from the bed, never taking his eyes off her. The zombie's gaze followed every move he made, the growling in her throat much louder now, sounding like a boat motor in the tiny room. Jenner saw her move toward him one tentative step, then two more. He put up his hands to ward her off, thinking as he did so that his fingers might look like tender pork sausages to her. The thought was horrible but strangely amusing. "I'm going to take you to get some food, okay?" he said, speaking very slowly and clearly. "Do you understand?" He couldn't tell if she did, but she must somehow. She'd been human once, for Christ's sake. "No, eat me, get it?" He pointed to himself and shook his head no at the same time. "I take you to food." Here he pointed at the door. "Okay?" Her expression didn't change, but she didn't come any closer either, so Jenner counted himself successful. Watching her for any sign of movement, he began to walk across the room, taking small, non-threatening steps, heading for the dresser where he dropped his keys. He had to pass within a foot of her, and his heart hammered, expecting an ambush. He had no doubt he could take her. She was a slight woman, and hopefully weakened by hunger and medications. Nevertheless, he didn't relish the idea of having a chunk of his arm bitten off. Zombification wasn't contagious, but the bites were nasty, painful, and full of bacteria. Amputation was the usual solution. Daisy did feint toward him, as though teasing, as he passed, and he had to use all his willpower to avoid screaming like a little girl. It wouldn't do to startle her, not when he thought he basically had her under control. Jenner grabbed his keys from the dresser and then whipped around to make sure she wasn't sneaking up on him. She had crept a bit closer, the growling still low in her throat, but she seemed almost curious, as though eager to eat him but wanting to see what he was up to first. It took him nearly 45 minutes to lure her out of the hotel room and into the car, his stomach in knots the entire time. Night had fallen outside and cars rushed past on the highway, though the parking lot of the motel was now thankfully empty. Jenner had a heart-stopping moment as he leaned into the back seat, snapping the seatbelt tight across Daisy's lap and wrists, which he had secured with a bedsheet. In the second it took to secure the belt, her stinking mouth had closed over the flesh of his right shoulder, and the prick of her teeth was like the sting of a razor on cold, dry skin. He gasped and pulled away, slapping her hard on her half-rotted cheek before he realized what he was doing. In the aftermath, with the sound of the slap still echoing in the dimmed parking lot, Jenner thought she looked more human than ever, the expression on her face exactly matching the indignant rage of a living woman who had just been slapped by a brutish man. Jenner was sorry he had done it, but when she lunged at him, he slapped her again, then shoved her back against the seat and slammed the door on her before her chomping teeth could find any purchase. Then he watched her struggling and spitting silently behind the window glass, wondering if anyone had seen him, and was at this very moment calling him a filthy wife-beater. At last, he made his way around the car and slid into the driver's seat. Daisy growled and strained against her bonds, but she was on the passenger side and couldn't quite reach him. After a while, she must have realized this, for she quieted down and settled back against the seat, but Jenner could still see her pulsing red eyes hating him in the rearview mirror. Where to take her, he wondered as he merged onto the highway. His first thought had been to find a bunch of homeless men under a bridge somewhere and let her loose among them. Perhaps they'd be too mercifully drunk to know what was happening. Thinking about the plan now, he was nearly paralyzed by a feeling of immense sadness and self-disgust. Why, just look at him, a well-regarded anthropologist and author, an all-around good guy, plotting the deaths of innocent human beings. And for what? He couldn't keep feeding her forever, and the idea that she could somehow be cured of her lust for human flesh was now beginning to seem faintly absurd in his depression. All of this because he'd simply wanted to know why. Why did the Reanimated suddenly develop a taste for human flesh? And why should he be punished like this for wanting to find out? He smacked the steering wheel. Did it really matter why? The point was that they did. Maybe Dr. Emerson had been right all along. And then Jenner had an idea. The parking lot at the university was nearly empty, and he had no trouble finding a space mere steps from his office. Before he did anything, he flipped open his cell phone and dialed, waiting for someone to pick up. When the call was answered on the third ring, Jenner rung off without speaking and stuck the phone back in his pocket. Daisy had been fairly subdued for most of the ride over, but now that they had stopped, she perked up again, wiggling against the seatbelt and gnashing her teeth together. Jenner was almost afraid to touch her, but in the end he leaned in quickly, undoing the belt, though leaving the sheet tied around her wrists, and pulling her out of the car before she could start gnawing at him. He walked behind her, pushing her ahead, holding her hands firmly behind her back. The halls were dim and deserted, though he saw slivers of light emanating from beneath a door here and there, other professors working late. He bypassed his own locked office with barely a glance. Daisy seemed to be sniffing the air, a strange purr rattling from her lips, but she behaved herself otherwise. She seemed to understand their purpose here. Jenner felt his confidence in his theory returning. After this, perhaps he would be able to work with Daisy more, make her case study the centerpiece of his next book. He would call it How I Tamed a Zombie, a new approach to dealing with the undead. It had a nice ring, he had to admit. Light shone through the pebbled glass window of Emerson's office, and Jenner thought he could just make out a stooped dark silhouette within. He imagined Emerson sitting in there, his pompous coiffed head bent over his desk. Was he working on his new book right now, thinking about how it would crush Jenner's ridiculous theory once and for all? Jenner felt his jaw tighten, along with his grip on Daisy's arms. She made a funny little yelp, like a dog whose tail has been stepped on. Jenner saw the silhouette in the office glance up at the sound. He'd expected the door to be locked, but it wasn't. He pushed Daisy to one side, keeping a tight grip on her, then simply swung open the door and stood on the threshold for a moment, relishing the look of surprise on Emerson's wrinkled face. Clearly the man could see something in his rival's eyes. Desperation, perhaps? Madness? Whatever he saw, it obviously frightened him, and Jenner had to smile at that. Emerson stared at him, obviously trying to save face by puffing himself up to appear intimidating. After what seemed like an age, he spoke, too loudly. "You might knock, Jenner, especially at this time of night," he said. "What is the meaning of this?" Jenner almost giggled, but then got a hold of himself. Maybe he was going mad after all. I've come to discuss my theory further with you, Doctor. Emerson got to his feet, his fingers stretching toward the phone on his desk. I'm calling security, Jenner. You're either drunk or insane, and frankly, I don't have the time or the inclination to determine which it is. He still hadn't seen Daisy, that much was apparent. He was nervous, but not that nervous. Don't call just yet, Emerson. Jenner took a few steps into the room, pulling the zombie behind him, her flesh upsettingly squishy in his hand. His body still mostly concealed her. I've been working on a definitive proof of my hypothesis, Doctor, and I thought you might like to see it for yourself. Emerson's eyes went as big as basketballs, and he backed away from his desk, the phone momentarily forgotten. Jenner, I know that is not what I think it is. He was pointing to Daisy. What have you done, for Christ's sake? I've only done it to show you, to show everybody, Jenner answered, guiding Daisy entirely into the office and closing the door gently behind her. Proof of my theory, big as life, Emerson. Daisy here has been with me for several hours. Not only that, but her medication has long worn off. But you see, she has not attacked me. Yes, she wanted to, I admit that, but I have been able to dissuade her. She has self-control, Emerson, and understanding, however rudimentary. Jenner didn't mention that Daisy had almost chewed his toes off, or that she had sunk her teeth into his shoulder in the car. He figured these were simply lapses in her reason, a lashing out of the behavior her condition had encouraged in her. And as such, he didn't feel the need to share these trivial lapses with his longtime rival. Emerson stood with his back against the wall, as though he'd like nothing better than to disappear into it. His terrified gaze never left Daisy's pallid face. Call her off, Jenner, he said, his voice barely a croak. Then, as though realizing what he had just said, he relented. All right, I'll grant that you have some control over her, that maybe your ideas have some merit, okay? I'll give you anything you want, say whatever you want. Just please, Jenner, please call her off. Jenner gave the zombie an encouraging little shove in Emerson's direction. She was growling again. I'm afraid I can't do that, Jenner said, his tone tinged with mock regret. I appreciate your recognition of my breakthrough, don't get me wrong. And she does have self-control. I'm going to work more on it in the coming months, wean her off the flesh-eating idea. But at the moment, he sighed, shaking his head. At the moment, she's starving. Hasn't had a good meal in I don't know how long. You'll be kind of the last supper for her, before she goes on the wagon, so to speak. Jenner was delighted at his own analogy, and laughed long and hard. Emerson's eyes cut from left to right, looking for some escape, but his office was small, windowless, and cluttered, and Jenner was blocking the only exit. He closed his eyes then, no doubt trying to erase the reality before him. You won't get away with this, Jenner, he whispered. Everyone will know what happened, they'll immediately suspect you. Daisy was almost on top of him now, her shambling steps growing ever more eager. I'm willing to take that chance, said Jenner, and then the zombie lurched toward Emerson, her hunger and desperation giving her strength. She bested the feeble old man easily, wrestling him to the ground and climbing atop his chest, her eyes glinting like Christmas bulbs. Emerson screamed once, a soft, papery shriek, but the sound was cut off, only to be replaced by a wet ripping noise, like the squelch of a hand in thick jelly. Jenner had thought he'd be sickened by the sight of Emerson being devoured, but now that he was witnessing it, he found himself feeling detached, as though he was simply observing a lab rat run a maze. Daisy ate and ate, seeming to never get full. Her teeth worried at the old man's flesh, tearing it loose in large red gobbets. She was soon awash in gore, presumably so lost in her own orgiastic feeding frenzy that she noticed neither the flying blood nor the animalistic grunts that issued from her body at regular intervals. It occurred to Jenner that the sound might attract a security guard, but like the sight of Emerson's flayed body, the possibility seemed unimportant. When Daisy had eaten her fill, leaving nothing of Emerson but tooth-marked bones and a few bits that looked like coughed-up hamburger, she leaned back on her haunches, closing her eyes in a shudderingly human expression of satiety. Jenner approached her, still cautious but not really afraid of her, despite the mess she'd made of Emerson. She seemed not to notice Jenner at all, caught up in whatever passed for reverie in the minds of the undead. Daisy? Jenner didn't wish to diminish the moment for her, but he wasn't particularly interested in being seen here either. They'd been in the office a long time, and someone was bound to come around sooner or later. She turned her head at the sound of her name, and regarded him with her now open eyes, which glowed redder than ever. Her gaunt, ghastly face was painted with blood, her cracked lips studded with scraps of skin and brain. Those lips parted then, exposing the black maw of mouth within, and as Jenner stared, incredulous, the growl in the back of her throat came forward to form a single word. More, she said. For a second, Jenner was too stunned to react. How could she talk? Yes, he'd believed her capable of it to a point, but now that he was actually hearing it, how could it be? None of the zombies he'd studied had ever spoken, and as far as he knew, no one else had ever heard them say anything. Was their reticence simply another function of the drugs they were kept on? As all of this raced through Jenner's mind, Daisy had crawled a few feet toward him, seeming bigger now, and certainly moving faster after her meal. It was only then that the impact of her single word penetrated Jenner's consciousness with the force of a sledgehammer. "Daisy, no," he said, trying to sound authoritative, but only succeeding in sounding like a terrified 6-year-old. "Good girl, Daisy. I gave you Emerson, now you can't just—" He backed toward the door, but she was on her feet in milliseconds, racing toward him with unbelievable speed, her former shambling pace completely gone. Jenner felt the doorknob poking into his back, and his hand closed over it, but she was already on him, fast and strong, her tongue churning over her teeth. Jenner struggled against her, managing to turn the knob in his panic, and then he was surprised as the door gave way, dumping him backwards out into the hall, Daisy riding his chest like a succubus, her claw-like fingers digging into his arms. He screamed, flat on his back, wondering where in the hell that security guard was now that he really needed him. The man must be deaf, for Christ's sake. But Daisy loomed over him, hungry and red-eyed, and feeling no pity. Seeing his death imminent above him, Jenner's fevered brain went into survival mode, throwing up any strategy that might conceivably save his neck. Daisy had spoken, hadn't she? And she had displayed simple understanding and self-control, just as he'd pointed out to the old man. Perhaps there was more of the human in her than anyone realized, and what was human could generally be reasoned with. "Daisy, please." Jenner's voice was reedy and desperate. "I'm your friend, right? I helped you. I took you away from that awful hospital. I brought you here to get food. Why are you doing this?" For a moment, she seemed to be considering his question, though her eyes still flickered and her bloody teeth still gnashed. She was so close that he could smell the sweet rotten stench of Emerson's flesh on her breath. She stared at him. "Why?" she said, as though tasting the word. Sensing he'd made an impression, Jenner jumped at the opening. Yes, Daisy, why?" She looked hard at him for another full minute, her weight and sudden strength pinning him to the floor. Then her shoulders rose and fell, almost imperceptibly, in what appeared to be an all-too-human gesture, a shrug of indifference. "I'm sorry, Doctor," she said in her grave-dirt raspy voice. "It's what we do." She lunged forward, mouth stretched wide, and Jenner had no time to scream again. The factory loomed gray and massive through the windshield, its 3 floors studded with broken windows that regarded the surroundings with flat malevolence. The sky behind the building seemed only too happy to contribute to the gloomy ambiance. It was only 2 in the afternoon, but rain had been threatening since morning. Kirsten Osgood pulled her rental car into the rubble-strewn lot and killed the engine. There were a few cars already there, though not as many as she expected. She turned to the boy in the passenger seat. "Should I park around back?" He grinned. "Nah, nobody ever drives out here except for us. Come on." His name was Micah, and he bore the lanky form and effortless grace of someone just on the cusp of majority. He got out of the car and closed the door behind him. Kirsten was slow to follow, reaching into the back seat for the bag that contained her notebook, cell phone, and other equipment. She got out and stood near the car, digging in the bag for her camera, which she used to squeeze off a few quick shots of the lowering structure before them and its background of scudding purple clouds. The boy had walked some distance ahead, and his shadowed figure was a stark focal point in the foreground. "Come on, Dr. Osgood," he called. She told him to call her Kirsten, but she let it go. Slinging the bag across her shoulder, she began to pick her way through the sand piles and mountains of shattered concrete, slipping a few times and cursing the lack of traction on her slick black dress flats. Ordinarily, she would have worn hiking boots on an expedition into the field, as it were, but Micah had been very specific about the dress code. "Come in your funeral best," he'd snickered on the phone. "Wear what you'd want to be buried in." He had waited for her about halfway between the car and the abandoned factory's entrance, and when she caught up to him, they began to walk together. Micah himself was clad in a somber ebony suit 2 sizes too big for him. Kirsten guessed he must have raided his father's closet. The solemn garb seemed incongruous in juxtaposition with Micah's rosy young face and the whimsical fall of white blonde dreadlocks that danced around his ears and shoulders. Do you feel what you're doing is dangerous, Micah? Kirsten thought she felt a drop of rain on her arm, and she glanced up at the rumbling sky. Micah thrust his hands into the pockets of his baggy trousers. Dangerous? Nah, not at all. I've done it loads of times, more than anyone else here. It's not dangerous, it's transcendent, man. You'll see. He grinned again, so widely that the pink of his gums showed. The entrance to the building had been partially concealed behind a towering stack of warped 2x4s and rusty machine parts. Just to be safe, Micah said with a wink. He led Kirsten around the rubble, kicking a few bits and pieces out of the way. The door itself was metal, its surface scarred with dents. Micah rapped 3 times, paused, then rapped twice. A squeal of metal on metal sounded from within, and then there was another sound, like the pattering of rust flakes upon a bare concrete floor. The door creaked open, seemingly by itself. Micah motioned to Kirsten, and she followed him inside. The dimness outdoors meant that her eyes needed little time to adjust, and within seconds she was gazing up and around at the vast ruined hulk, its contours only partly visible in the gray glow from the smashed windows. It used to be a glass factory, ironically enough, Micah said as though he had read her thoughts. His voice seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Me and Christus found it last year. Is Christus his real name? She asked. Micah shrugged. It is now. Suddenly a shadow separated itself from the dark masses in the corners and began to move toward them. Kirsten flinched, but then she saw that it was just an old man, perhaps the person who had opened the door for them. Is this a scientist? He was dressed only in a long white sheet that he had wrapped around himself several times, like a cocoon. Or a shroud, Kirsten thought. I'm Dr. Osgood, the anthropologist, she said, stepping forward and offering her hand. But please call me Kirsten. This close to him, she could see that his white hair was matted and filthy, his eyes wild. He didn't move to shake her hand, and after a few awkward seconds, she withdrew it. The old man looked at Micah. You're late. The feast was supposed to start 15 minutes ago. He chewed at his lips, perhaps to demonstrate to Micah how hungry he was. Sorry, Isaac. Just lead the way. We'll be right behind you. Isaac turned his back and began shuffling toward another metal door that gleamed from the shadows beneath the rusting catwalk. Kirsten leaned close to Micah, his dreadlocks tickling her nose. I get the feeling I'm not welcome here, she said. A few of the members don't like the idea of outsiders studying them, Micah admitted, but Christus is the boss and he said it was okay. Everyone will come around, you'll see. Kirsten certainly hoped she would. The rain had begun in earnest now, and fat drops beat a steady rhythm on the roof, leaking in through the cracks and crumbling plaster. The whole building smelled of mold and dust and oil, with the fresher scents of chalk and candle wax adding spice to the stew. Isaac had disappeared through the second door, and Micah followed a few steps behind. Watch your step, he said, glancing over his shoulder. Kirsten found herself emerging into a space even bigger than the first, but much darker, as the fewer windows were high up near the ceiling and appeared to have been painted over. The floor level was awash in the thick yellow glow from countless flickering candles, alternating black and white wax pillars that defined a gigantic circle around the room. In the center of the circle was a long table covered with a black cloth. Figures moved around it, their numbers unclear in the shadows. Micah spoke in her ear. The feast, he explained, gesturing toward the table. Kind of a symbolic Last Supper. Kirsten wasn't quite sure what she expected, given what she'd heard about these people, but when a space cleared, she was surprised to see only an ordinary table piled with ordinary food of every description. A whole roasted turkey, a couple of hams, nuts in wooden bowls, boiled eggs, various pastas and salads and dips in white plastic containers. She even recognized a few sandwich platters and dessert trays from one of the chain supermarkets in town. She almost laughed, but managed to stifle it. None of the people in the room, who all wore black suits like Micah's or loose shrouds like Isaac's, save for 2 or 3 girls present who wore simple knee-length black dresses similar to Kirsten's own, seemed to have noticed her at all, so intent were they on filling the styrofoam plates they held in their pale hands. Well, help yourself, Micah said, placing his hand lightly on her elbow and guiding her toward the table. Eat as much as you want, we always bring plenty. Kirsten wasn't particularly hungry, but she thought it best in the interest of research and camaraderie that she go along with all the customs in order to get the entire experience. She picked up a plate from the pile at the table's edge, feeling like an intruder. So you're going to study us? One of the girls stood at her shoulder, black eyes pierced by reflected points of candle flame. That's sort of the idea, Kirsten said, nonchalantly grabbing a handful of pretzels. I'm Eliza, the girl said. She was red-haired and voluptuous, her skin like porcelain. Kirsten, would you mind if I asked you some questions after? She wasn't sure how they referred to the main part of their ceremony, so she let the request dangle. After the rebirth? The flicker of the candles made odd shadows across her face, turning her features into those of a skull. Are you going to rebirth with us? Kirsten tried to smile. I'm planning to, yes. Her throat was dry, the smell of wax coating the insides of her mouth and nose. Oh, just wait, Eliza said. She plucked a large piece of ham from the table and popped it into her mouth hole. Afterwards, you can ask me whatever you want, she said, chewing. Thanks, Kirsten said. The girl stared at her for a few more seconds, then wandered off, the black fabric of her dress soon indistinguishable from the garb of the others. Kirsten finished filling her plate and retreated to a dim corner, trying to be unobtrusive. She didn't want anyone to act any differently than they normally would. She simply wanted to observe them, not make them feel that they had to perform for her. She knew some self-consciousness among the subjects was to be expected, but she preferred to keep it to a minimum. A few of the others came up to her and introduced themselves, and since all seemed friendly and open enough, she was able to secure promises for several more interviews. Her stomach was fluttering uncontrollably, a feeble protest against what she had gotten herself into, but she still managed to force down most of the food on her plate. Once everyone had finished eating and deposited the trash in a large bin near the back of the room, there was a general milling around as members talked animatedly with one another, their eyes lit orange and yellow by the flames. Kirsten couldn't hear what they were saying, but the air around them vibrated with excitement, and perhaps even a twinge of fear, although that might have been Kirsten projecting her own state of mind onto others. The rain outside provided a droning backdrop for the musical cadence of mingled conversation. At some predetermined point that everyone seemed to instinctively acknowledge, the voices grew muted and finally stopped altogether. The people in the room, at least 36 of them by Kirsten's rough estimate, began gathering silently on the inside perimeter of the candle ring, leaving a large empty space in the middle. Kirsten spotted Micah's blonde dreadlocks in the crowd, and when she met his gaze, he beckoned to her, smiling encouragingly. Her heart was beginning to pound, but she returned his smile and moved toward him, situating herself between him and Eliza in the circle. A man emerged from the ring and stepped slowly into the center, the candles sending his shadow flitting off in several directions at once. The man, presumably Christus, held his hands out unnecessarily for silence, and then closed his eyes and began to chant in some language Kirsten couldn't identify. He was a handsome young man, about the same age as Micah, with close-cropped brown hair and a strong jaw. His dark suit bore a rather dapper pattern of gray pinstripes, which Kirsten found strangely out of place given the setting. He wore thin-rimmed spectacles, and the flames made the glass over his eyes glow like twin yellow suns. Once he had finished his invocation, he produced a small object from his pocket. Kirsten couldn't tell what it was at first, but then he knelt down and began drawing on the concrete floor with it, and she realized it was a long piece of white chalk. There was no sound in the room at all, except for the rain outside, and the scraping noise of the chalk as it defined shape after shape in the center of the circle. Christus worked quickly and confidently, his arms moving with sharp, sure strokes. In the dimness, Kirsten squinted to see what Christus was drawing. It seemed to be a series of large identical shapes, mirroring the arc of the circle, like long boxes lined up around a clock face. As he completed the top half of the circle from Kirsten's perspective, she finally figured out what the shapes resembled: coffins. She could have been mistaken, that was true, but she didn't think so. The shapes were like 6-foot-long polygons, short on top and longer at the bottom, where the legs would go. And now she could see, by the flickering glow of the candles, that Christus had drawn a neat cross in the middle of each box. She shivered. At last, Christus returned to the center of the circle, wiping the chalk dust from the tips of his fingers. He spoke again in the strange tongue. To Kirsten, it almost sounded like a nonsense language, with bits of bastardized Latin and perhaps French thrown into the mix. She glanced around at the others, who all stared intensely at their leader, faces beatific. They clearly understood what he was saying, or at least pretended they did. Christus then made a sweeping gesture with his hand, making the candles around him gutter slightly in the ensuing breeze. The followers in the circle began to move, almost as though hypnotized. Kirsten felt a poke in her ribs and turned to see Micah pointing to one of the chalk coffins on the floor. "Time to go," he whispered. "It'll be okay." He then lowered himself onto his knees and lay full out inside one of the chalk outlines, folding his arms across his chest and closing his eyes. A tiny, knowing smile remained on his youthful face. The others, except for Christus, were following suit, lying flat upon the floor, the star attractions of their own funerals. Kirsten was reminded unpleasantly of news footage she'd seen about the mass suicides at Jonestown, and for a moment she considered simply walking out, going back to her office at the university. Her book wouldn't be any less thorough for not having included this particularly bizarre modern cult, would it? Compared to some of the other sects she was researching, this one was, after all, pretty small potatoes. As she stood there hesitantly, the others had settled into their positions, motionless, as if death had already overtaken them. Christus was still standing in the center, his face partially shadowed by the bright glow of the candles behind him. He looked at her, kindly, then gestured toward the one remaining chalk coffin at her feet, the one that lay empty, waiting for her body to fill it. She felt the blood rush to her face, then quickly dropped to the floor, arranging herself in a corpse-like pose. She didn't like the idea of closing her eyes, not knowing what to expect, but she did it reluctantly. In the darkness behind her eyelids, all her other senses became supernaturally attuned, and she thought she could hear the steady breathing of all the others in the room, even hear a few fluttering heartbeats. The smell of the candles was thick in her nostrils, making her sleepy. As she floated there, hands trembling on her chest, she heard Christus's shuffling footsteps moving away. After a few moments, she began to relax, wondering if perhaps she might doze off before finding out exactly what was about to happen. And it did seem as if several hours had passed before Christus's footfalls became loud again, before his breathing drowned out that of the others playing dead beside her. She felt his presence very close, and almost opened her eyes, but instead closed them tighter, willing him to pass her by. There was a sound very close to her face, like a quick exhale, and then there was the feeling of warm air on her cheeks, and something else, a tickling sensation on her skin, like the brush of many tiny wings. It was pleasant at first, and she almost smiled, but immediately it began to hurt, contracting the delicate flesh of her face as though sucking out all the moisture. It stung and burrowed, and she gasped, but she found that she couldn't get any air at all, that her nose and mouth seemed to have ceased functioning, that the muscles in her throat were no longer adequate to draw oxygen into her lungs. She panicked and her eyes popped open, but all she saw was the fading glow of the candle flames as they were snuffed out one by one. She couldn't scream or even shed a tear. Her limbs were rigid, her muscles useless. Her eyes closed of their own volition, and she could not open them again. The blackness spiraled toward her and overtook her, hurtling her into a nothing space where she felt detached from her body, only her sense of hearing and smell keeping her tethered to temporal reality. With her still working ears, she heard her heart slow its beating, and finally cease altogether. And then an enormous silence. It was impossible for her to tell how long she remained in this limbo state, neither truly dead nor truly alive, neither asleep nor awake. She could no longer hear anything save for the disjointed babbling of her own thoughts. It was a horrifying experience, trapped in a body that was no longer her own, unable to see, surrounded by dozens of the quasi-dead, each trapped inside his or her own private hell. Her thoughts began to twist and mutate in ways she didn't like, ways that could only be described as madness. After a while, her brain no longer produced words at all, but only a thin, high scream that seemed to ring in her ears from without. It was only after an infinity, after she had finally settled into her death and accepted it, that she was startled by another blast of warm air upon her face, another tingle of falling fairy dust. The heavy footsteps were back again, though Kirsten was so far gone that she could barely remember whose they were or what was happening to her. The powder tickled her nose and lips, giving the sensation of a limb regaining its circulation, and after a few minutes she found she was able to open her mouth and wrinkle her nose, and a few minutes after that she took a huge whooping breath that seemed to inflate her lungs almost to bursting. It was painful, but the tears that popped into her eyes were tears of relief, not agony. All around her the others were shifting and moaning and gasping. A few cried, a few laughed with lunatic trills. Kirsten could see light spilling in from the next room and the haphazardly painted windows high above, and she deduced that it was morning. They had been dead all night, watched over by Christus, resurrected by him when dawn came, to face life anew. It had been an unpleasant experience, but Kirsten had to admit she could see the allure in it. Once the followers had shaken off the effects of the drug and its antidote, They got slowly to their feet and stood very still in the middle of their chalk coffins, their heads lowered as if in prayer. Kirsten followed suit, trying to see out of the corner of her eye, wondering what the next step would be. But there was only Christus in his odd pinstriped suit, going around the circle and lighting the candles once again, then stopping at each follower to kiss his or her forehead and draw a shape, presumably a cross, in the same spot. With a wave of his hand, he released the resurrectees from their deathly prisons, and then each follower leaped gleefully from his or her chalk outline, face glowing with possibility. There was another banquet laid out on the long table, this one less substantial but more suited to the morning hours. Fruit, bagels, cheeses, coffee, and tea. Kirsten was impressed. Obviously, a great deal of thought and expense had gone into the preparations. She glanced around the room for Micah but didn't see him right away. She knew Eliza and a few of the others had agreed to talk with her, but at the moment she wanted to speak to Christus. She found him slightly apart from the others, not eating or drinking anything, but simply watching the followers as they basked in their rebirth. He smiled at her as she approached, but it was a distant smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Did you enjoy the experience?" he asked. I don't know if enjoy is the right word, but it was certainly enlightening. She leaned against the wall next to him, looking out over the candlelit feast. "How long have you been doing this?" "About a year. We only had 5 members when we started out, including Micah and myself." "It seems an amalgam of belief systems," she observed. Christus shrugged. "The core of the doctrine, of course, is the idea of resurrection. We use many of the trappings of Christianity because that's the mythology that our followers are most familiar with, and because resurrection plays a large part in that mythology. But the main inspiration for the sect was Haitian Vodun, or more specifically the zombie powder used by Vodun priests. Described by Wade Davis in The Serpent and the Rainbow," Kirsten said. "Yes. Micah saw the movie and wondered if we could replicate the formula." Christus smiled indulgently, as if speaking of a beloved but not exceptionally bright child. "He's not one for reading, but he loves all the zombie films, Romero, Fulci, even the newer remakes. We incorporated a bit of that in the belief system, too. We even took some dialogue from movies and put it in our invocations, disguised a little, of course. Personally, I liked the idea of a ritual based around a symbolic death and rebirth, so I began researching. I stumbled across the recipe for the zombie powder online, as it happens, and it wasn't terribly hard to make, although obtaining the blowfish poison was a bit iffy. The antidote, though, I had to devise myself." Kirsten turned to him, incredulous. "You mean you had to come up with something to counteract the neurotoxin?" Christus lowered his eyes humbly. "I've always had a knack for chemistry, nothing more. If anyone deserves praise, it's Micah." Kirsten drew in a breath. "He was your guinea pig." "Naturally. It was all his doing, though. I couldn't talk him out of it." Kirsten finally saw Micah's blonde dreads bobbing in the crowd, and she looked at him with renewed interest. It wasn't respect for him, she felt, not really, but neither was it pity or disgust. She wasn't sure what it was exactly. "He could have died," she said at last. "Indeed, he very well could have." Despite his young age, Christus's voice bore the stilted, refined tones of an Oxford Don. Kirsten was impressed by his eloquence. "But as you can see, he seems to have emerged unscathed, as have you, Dr. Osgood." He smiled again, more warmly this time, and drifted away from her to join his born-again followers around the breakfast table. Later, Kirsten sat in her office, poring over the notes and photos and recordings she'd made about her experiences. She'd managed to get 4 different followers to answer her questions, but they had all said more or less the same thing. The sect had changed their lives, bolstered their spirits, indulged their need for ritual, and, if truth be told, theatrical morbidity. Kirsten hated to admit it, but she'd felt a similar sense of renewed purpose since leaving the compound this morning, a sense that she had cheated death and could now take on the world without fear. The feeling lasted well into the evening. She had worked past her usual time, not noticing the office growing dimmer and dimmer as the light faded outside. She only looked up at the sound of her stomach rumbling. She hadn't eaten since the awakening this morning. Looking longingly at her notes, she finally resigned herself to going home, maybe stopping for a quick bite to eat along the way. She rose from her chair, her muscles creaking, and reached for her raincoat. The phone shrilled, stopping her hand in midair. "Dr. Osgood," she said into the receiver. "So are you coming again?" The voice was immediately recognizable as Micah's. Kirsten laughed. "So soon? I've hardly recovered from last night. But you want to, right?" She paused. Did she? The symbolic death of the night before hadn't exactly been a pleasurable experience, but there was something about coming just to the brink of madness, then being pulled back, that was exalting, invigorating. "I suppose I wouldn't mind one more go," she said. She thought she had enough material for the chapter she was writing, but it wouldn't hurt to clarify a few things, now that she knew what to expect. "We'll be meeting again tomorrow night," Micah said, his tone conspiratorial. "Do you remember where it is, or do you need me to ride with you?" "I can find it, Micah." She chuckled a little at his enthusiasm, but frankly it disturbed her a little. He sounded like a junkie hankering for a fix. "Same time?" "Yep, see you there." He had hung up before she had a chance to say goodbye. Kirsten put the phone thoughtfully back into its cradle. She had been researching this book for nearly a year now, and this was the first time that she had actually felt some kind of pull toward the sect that she was observing. She knew it wasn't right, wasn't objective. But then again, what was one more time through the motions? No one was forcing her to go along with the rituals. She could leave whenever she wanted to if she got uncomfortable. These people were not her life, and after the book was written, she need never have to see them again. So thinking, she glanced once more at the pile of papers on her desk, then shrugged into her raincoat and headed out of the office, locking the door behind her. It was sunny this time as she pulled into the mostly empty dirt lot in front of the compound, but that fact didn't make the building itself seem any less menacing. The broken windows glared down at her like cataract-ridden eyes, and the silence boomed like an authoritative voice. At her knock, the same shroud-clad old man, Isaac she remembered, pulled open the metal door and admitted her, not speaking at all, and barely looking at her except to raise his upper lip in an obvious gesture of contempt. She followed him silently through the echoing spaces until they arrived at the room with the candles, which she'd already come to think of as the chapel. All the followers were already there, preparing for their umpteenth Last Supper, gathering around the table with plates in hand. Kirsten spotted Micah in the crowd and waved to him. He returned the wave, but the motion seemed listless, and his previously rosy complexion appeared chalky and drawn. Kirsten attributed this to the pale flicker book illumination from the candles, and grabbed a plate of her own. From that point, the ritual strayed not at all from the one she had witnessed 2 nights before. This time, she was far surer of herself, going through the motions without hesitation, even lying down in her ersatz coffin without so much as a qualm. She found that she even welcomed the fluttering feel of the blowfish poison upon her face and the tightening of the flesh that it caused. When she became immobile, she simply let herself float, experiencing the simulated death in a way she'd been too frightened to before. The madness, when it came, was almost like a warm, nurturing embrace, a reminder to let oneself go, to simply be, at one with the darkness and the terror. This time, the experience seemed all too short, and she felt she had only just begun to enjoy herself when Christus's light footsteps signaled the coming of the dawn. The antidote fell like an angel's wings upon her skin, and she breathed it in, along with the promise of renewal it brought. The others awoke at their own pace, stretching and yawning in their coffins, smiling and blinking their eyes. Conversation was still disjointed at this point, but became more vigorous as the antidote took its full effect. Kirsten bounded up, feeling better than she had in a long while, the smell of coffee and apple danishes making her mouth water. As soon as Christus's blessing released her, she was heading for the feast table, ravenous. Then a thin scream stopped her in her tracks. She almost knew what she was going to see before she turned around. As she did, the scene before her took on the dimensions of a nightmare, the flickering candles making huge monstrous shadows upon the walls, the faces of the followers sallow and long, their mouths and eyes as black as bottomless holes. Most of them were gathered around a particular spot on the floor where Kirsten remembered Micah bedding down for the evening. Feeling as though her whole body had once again become rigid and lifeless, she began slowly moving toward the gathering. Micah lay, still as a wax figurine, his hands still crossed over his chest, his feet oddly bare beneath the 2 long pant legs of his oversized black suit. His face was slack but peaceful, a hint of his sunny grin still apparent. Christus stood at Micah's head, his hand open. At his followers' questioning glances, he looked up, sweat beading on his brow. "I gave him the antidote," Christus said. His outstretched palm was still coated with a brownish powder. "He's dead," Eliza breathed, looking down at Micah with something like rapture. "He's dead for real." "No." Kirsten wasn't sure why she had spoken, wasn't sure why she was suddenly the expert in such matters. "No, he can't be dead. Maybe the powder is just taking longer than usual to work. Maybe you didn't give him enough." She had knelt near Micah's feet and now glanced up at Christus's twitching face. "I did. I gave him the same amount I always give everyone." His palm was still open and now obviously trembling. "What are we going to do?" "We need to get him to a hospital," Kirsten said. "No." That was Isaac. "Do you have any idea what they'll do to the rest of us if they find out about this? We'll be arrested for poisoning him." There were murmurs of assent from the others. Kirsten looked around at them. "Well, you can't just leave him like this." "Perhaps he will come around in time," said Christus, who was now standing a little way behind the others, his arms folded across his chest. He looked calm, but Kirsten could see uncertainty dancing in his eyes. "We should just wait to see what happens." Kirsten turned on him. "Your antidote must not be completely effective." "It is." Christus's skin was waxy in the candlelight. "It's always worked before." "Not this time." She glanced down at Micah's prone body, so young, almost monstrously pale. There was no way he was ever getting up again. And then something he said on the first day she had come here resonated in her ears. "He said he'd done this more times than anybody," Kirsten said, almost in a whisper. "That's true." Christus was looking at her warily. "Well, that must be it. The antidote is only effective up to a point. Maybe after so much exposure it becomes toxic, or no longer does what you designed it to do." Christus didn't answer. The candles flickered silently around him, giving him a faint orange halo. Kirsten looked to the others. Not Isaac, he clearly didn't like her, but Eliza and some of the others she'd interviewed on the first day. "Please," she said, "we can't just leave him here. He has a family." She was met with nothing but stone faces. "All right then." She whipped around on her heel and began marching toward the exit. But before she'd even moved 10 yards, she could see the followers closing in ahead of her, blocking her path. "Don't do this," she said, but they were doing it, pressing their bodies against hers. They didn't seem as though they wanted to hurt her, but they looked stern, and Kirsten had no doubt that they could resort to violence if she tried to fight her way through them. She sighed and raised her hands in surrender. "Fine, I won't go and tell anyone, at least not yet. What do you propose we do in the meantime?" "For the moment, we will sit and wait," Christus said. Morning opened into afternoon, and then began to fade toward early evening. Micah had not moved an inch, and in fact had started to reek in the smoke-clogged atmosphere. He was definitely gone for good. Kirsten noticed the followers giving each other furtive, confused glances, and she surmised that they were also coming to grips with the inevitable fact of the death, but were trying to deny it to themselves. She didn't worry about them at this point. They would have to come around and face reality eventually. Just as dark was beginning to fall outside the windows, Christus stirred from the shadowed corner where he'd been sitting. He crossed the room, ignoring everyone's eyes upon him, and knelt down next to Micah's peaceful corpse. Kirsten thought she saw his lips moving, but she couldn't hear the words. After a moment, he stood up and surveyed the assembled crowd. "Joshua, David, Michael, I need some help moving him." 3 young men separated themselves from the gaping followers and approached their master. Kirsten got to her feet. "What are you going to do?" Christus didn't even deign to look at her. "Bury him, of course. Nothing more can be done for him now." She risked a few steps toward them, keeping an eye on the others, who seemed tense but kept still for the moment. "You can't do that. There are laws." Realizing that appealing to his sense of justice was probably not going to be effective, she changed tacks. "If you bury him out here, it really will look like murder. No one will understand." Isaac was suddenly at her elbow, his wheezing breath hot upon her skin. "You're just a visitor here," he rasped, poking at her with one bony finger. "You can't tell Christus what to do." "I can tell him when something he's doing is wrong. Don't you see that I'm thinking of the rest of you, of trying to keep you out of trouble?" "We don't need your help, thank you," said Christus coldly. He turned to his 3 henchmen. "Grab Micah's legs and arms. We can bury him out back near the shell mound." Kirsten opened her mouth to speak again, but she knew it would be useless. There was obviously no reasoning with Christus or any of his followers. At this point, it was probably in her best interest to simply abort the project and get out while she still could. The followers seemed momentarily distracted by the lifting of Micah's body, so Kirsten began shuffling very slowly toward the door, cutting her eyes to the left and right as she went. It appeared that no one was going to stop her. Just then, there was a scream, and that sound did stop her, sending a finger of ice racing up her spine. Over where Christus and the others were carrying the body was chaos, and she could hardly see what was going on in the dim light from the candles. The scream came again, a man's scream, but still very high-pitched, clearly terrified. At the end of the scream came a series of babbling sounds that almost resolved themselves into words, one of which, Kirsten was sure, was biting. The other followers were rushing around now, knocking over candlesticks, sending hot wax splattering in every direction, snuffing out the illumination. In the dark, Kirsten could see a struggle, and though she tried to make her way toward the exit, she lost her bearings in the newly fallen shadows. All around her were the sounds of grunts and shrieks and heavy breathing. Kirsten found her way to a corner and curled up there, her hands protecting her head. The scuffle seemed to last for hours, though in reality it was probably no more than 5 minutes. When the sounds had died down to almost nothing, Kirsten risked a peek through her fingers. Someone, perhaps Christus, had righted a few of the candles and lit them again. In their paltry glow, Kirsten thought she could see a few of the followers lying on the concrete floor, very still. All around them were rough black masses like Rorschach ink blots. Kirsten first thought of the black candles that had been kicked over in the melee, but the more she looked, the more the puddles seemed to have a reddish cast, not like wax, but blood. More candles were lit, and then Kirsten saw something that for a moment her reeling brain was too stunned to understand. There was Micah, standing amid the prone figures, 4 of the more muscular followers holding his arms, restraining him. Micah's smooth, baby young face was smeared with more of the dark substance. His eyes were hollow and wild, his skin blue. Kirsten watched him, awestruck, and noticed that his chest did not rise and fall, his eyes did not blink. He was a dead man, animated by some chemical cocktail coursing through his rotting veins. Christus emerged from behind the undead horror, a white pillar candle gripped in his hand. His face was scraped raw on one side, his well-kept hair disheveled. He stared down at the dead members of his church, and his expression bore nothing of regret or responsibility. His breath came in great gasps. "I told you it always worked," he said between breaths, addressing no one in particular. Micah's eyes glittered in the firelight. He surveyed the crowd, his expression suggesting nothing but animal need. Kirsten watched him, transfixed. The knowledge that she should leave now while everyone was distracted was there, but it was a distant voice in her brain, hardly audible. She sat and watched. Eliza was the first to go forward, approaching Micah with her hands outstretched, stepping over the bodies of her dead comrades as if they were nothing but strewn refuse. Kirsten couldn't see her face, but her posture was one of supplication, adoration. "Micah," said the girl, her hands now only inches from his face, "you are the new Messiah." She held her fingers out toward his mouth, and with almost casual ferocity, Micah leaned forward and bit them off, crunching the bones between his teeth, allowing the blood to course down his chin. Eliza gasped at the pain, but then laughed, a high gobbling sound. "Take the flesh of my body," she cried, and from all around the room came a stirring, the air growing thick with it, a feeling like the one Kirsten had experienced at countless religious revivals, the feeling right before someone began speaking in tongues or rolling around on the floor like a possessed thing. Eliza was practically cramming her hands into Micah's mouth now, and he was obliging her, tearing off the meat as quickly as he could chew and swallow it. Kirsten leaped to her feet almost without thinking, her body longing for escape, but she found that she could still not turn away from the spectacle. Christus picked that moment to intervene, trying to pull Micah away by his hair. The 4 men that had been holding the undead creature were loosening their hold, perhaps drawn in by the drama unfolding before them, perhaps falling under the spell that Eliza had woven by her sacrifice. Christus's strength was not equal to Micah's, and the leader's efforts were mostly in vain. "Stop this," he said, waving the lit candle in Micah's face, hoping to deter him. "Micah is nothing but a monster. He's not a Messiah, I'm your Messiah, and you must obey me." His voice echoed like a god's voice, but it seemed fewer and fewer of the followers were heeding it, though Isaac staked out a position right behind Christus and screamed assent with his master's wishes. Eliza had fallen to her knees, clasping her gnawed-off hand to her chest, letting the blood spray in great arcs around her. Her eyes had rolled back into her head, and she was murmuring something under her breath, something that sounded like a chant. Most of the other followers had gathered around her, touching her with tenuous fingers as though she was a holy relic, and then they were forming a rough line in front of Micah, beseeching him to make them holy as well by taking a sacrifice of their body. It was like a communion in reverse. Kirsten, finally awakening somewhat from the disbelieving thrall that had held her, began to look around the room for her bag, hoping she could get a few photos of this momentous and bizarre occasion. She began searching along the walls for it, finally seeing it pushed back into a corner not far from where she was standing. The whole time she could hear shouts and screams and ecstatic moans, punctuated by Christus's ranting and the sound of teeth crushing bone and sinew. The waxy smell of the air began to take on the pungent stench of an abattoir. Kirsten had retrieved her camera and focused the surreal scene in the viewfinder when she noticed that the dead church members on the floor were also beginning to stir, and with mounting horror she watched them struggle to their feet, wounds gaping and blood spilling as they moved. Kirsten's fingers froze on the shutter button. Micah had taken exploratory bites from several of the church members by now, and some were lying on the concrete floor, holding their wounds and allowing themselves to quietly bleed to death, their faces aglow with a strange inner light. Christus and Isaac and a few remaining followers still on the side of the living had been backed into a far corner, their faces white and terrified as they saw the growing numbers of the Church of the Dead. It was clearly going to be no contest. Kirsten finally managed to squeeze off a few pictures before cramming the camera back into her bag and heading for the exit. No one had noticed her so far, and book or no book, she wasn't going to let this continue any longer. She would have to get out, to call the police or someone who could come in here and stop all of this, whatever it was that was happening. In the guttering dimness, she saw shapes gathering ahead of her, blocking her way to the exit. Panicked, she crouched down and ran straight at them, hoping to force her way through by keeping her body as far from their searching teeth as possible. The space near the door was nearly all shadows, and she shoved her way ahead, blindly, lashing out with her arms in her heavy equipment bag. For a moment she couldn't breathe, feeling as though the smell of the candles and the blood was choking her, and she tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just when she thought she could see the door ahead, nothing more than a rectangular crack of light floating in a black space, she felt hands clawing at her from all sides, fingers scraping across her back and shoulders. She did scream then, but her scream was lost amid the agonized howling from Christus and his few holdouts, who had finally fallen to the adherents of the new creed. In the stinking darkness, Kirsten felt her bag and her clothes being ripped away, and before the fingers and teeth began to sink into her flesh, she had time to think of her forced conversion, time to think of whether she would remember herself when she awakened as an acolyte of this new denomination. A schism of monumental proportions, she thought, and she had been here to witness it. Then, with gnashing teeth, the followers of the new faith descended.